Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. Most people wake up to birds chirping or their alarm clock. Last Tuesday, I woke up to the rhythmic snap of 10,000 volts running through my prize hydrangeas. I thought I was dreaming at first. You know that sound electric fences make, that sharp clicking noise every few seconds? It was coming from somewhere in my backyard. I stumbled out of bed, still in my pajamas, and looked out the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a brand new fence running straight through my garden, not along the property line where you'd expect a fence to be, but cutting right through the middle of my carefully maintained beds, 10 feet into my property, maybe more. The wire was strung tight between metal posts that definitely weren't there when I left for my weekend trip. I've lived in this house for 8 years now. The previous owners were master gardeners, and I've spent countless hours and thousands of dollars maintaining what they called their heritage garden. We're talking about heirloom tomatoes that took 3 generations to perfect, rose bushes that are older than I am, and a vegetable patch that produces enough food to feed half the neighborhood each summer. This wasn't just grass and weeds, this was living history. My neighbor, let's call him Gary since I'm trying to keep this somewhat anonymous, is a retired contractor who's lived in the house next door for about 20 years. He's one of those guys who thinks longevity equals authority. Just because he's been here the longest, he acts like he's the unofficial mayor of our little street. Gary has this whole might makes right attitude that shows up in everything from how he parks his truck to how he talks to the mailman. For months, Gary had been making these weird comments whenever he saw me working in the garden. Little things like how my plants were getting awfully tall and blocking his view, or how that patch of sun really belonged more to his yard than mine anyway. I figured it was just typical neighbor small talk mixed with maybe a little jealousy. My garden is pretty spectacular, especially in late summer when everything is in full bloom. What I didn't realize was that Gary had been plotting something much more serious than casual complaints. So there I was, Tuesday morning, staring at this fence that had magically appeared while I was visiting my sister upstate. I threw on some clothes and headed outside to get a closer look. As I approached the garden, I could hear that clicking sound getting louder. When I reached out to touch one of my tomato plants that was now on the other side of the wire, I heard this distinct electrical hum. That's when I spotted the sign. Facing my house, attached to one of the fence posts, was a yellow and black warning sign that read, "Danger High Voltage." Not facing Gary's property where someone might accidentally wander too close, but facing my house. Like I was being warned to stay out of my own yard. I'm not the type of person who loses his temper easily. Years of working in customer service taught me that staying calm usually gets you further than screaming. But standing there in my own backyard looking at an electric fence that was essentially holding my garden hostage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Pure, focused anger. I walked around the fence line documenting everything with my phone. The posts were driven deep into my lawn, leaving ugly brown patches where they'd damaged the grass. The wire cut right through a section of my herb garden, separating my basil and oregano plants from the rest of the bed. One of my grandmother's rose bushes, which I'd transplanted from her house after she passed, was now trapped on the wrong side of Gary's electric barrier. After I finished taking pictures, I walked over to Gary's house. It was still early, maybe 7 in the morning, but I could see lights on in his kitchen. I knocked on his front door and waited. Gary opened the door wearing a dirty t-shirt and holding a cup of coffee. When he saw me, this smug little smile spread across his face. He didn't say hello or good morning or ask how my trip was. He just stood there grinning like he'd pulled off the greatest prank in neighborhood history. I kept my voice level and polite. I told him I'd just discovered the fence and wanted to discuss it with him. Gary's response was not what I expected. He said he'd checked the old plot maps and discovered that I'd been squatting on his land for years. According to him, he was just reclaiming what was rightfully his. Then he added, almost like an afterthought, that I shouldn't touch the wire because it would give me a nasty bite. No apology, no explanation about why he'd done it while I was away. Just this matter-of-fact declaration that half my garden now belonged to him. I told him I'd be verifying his claim about the property lines. Gary just shrugged and said I could do whatever I wanted, but the fence was staying up. He suggested I might want to replant my vegetables on my side of the wire, assuming there was anything left worth saving. That's when I realized Gary wasn't just grabbing land. He was trying to destroy something I'd spent years building. This wasn't about property rights or boundary disputes. This was about power. Gary wanted to prove he could take whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, and there wasn't anything I could do about it. I walked back to my house without another word. Gary probably thought he'd won because I didn't start yelling or threaten to call the police. What he didn't know was that I was already forming a plan. The first thing I did was call a surveyor. Not just any surveyor, but the most expensive, most thorough land surveying company in our county. I scheduled an emergency appointment for that afternoon and agreed to pay their rush fee without hesitation. If Gary wanted to play games with property lines, we were going to establish exactly where those lines were. While I waited for the surveyor, I did some research on local ordinances related to electric fencing. What I found was very interesting. Temporary electrified fencing for livestock required a special permit and had to be installed at least 5 feet from any property line. Since Gary wasn't raising cattle and his fence was allegedly on the property line, he was already in violation of multiple city codes. The surveyor arrived around noon. He was an older gentleman who'd been doing boundary work for 30 years. I explained the situation and showed him the fence. He just shook his head and started unpacking his equipment. About halfway through the survey process, Gary came strutting over. He was wearing his sunglasses even though it was cloudy, and he had a beer in his hand despite it being the middle of a weekday afternoon. Gary tried to intimidate the surveyor by hovering around and making comments about how some people couldn't accept reality. The surveyor ignored Gary completely and continued his work. When Gary got too close to the equipment, the surveyor politely but firmly told him to step back. Gary didn't like being dismissed by someone he couldn't bully, so he went back to his house muttering about how everyone was wasting their time. 2 hours later, the surveyor had his answer. The fence was 100% on my property, not on the line, not in some disputed gray area, but completely and totally within my boundaries. Gary's electric fence was about 12 feet inside my property line at its closest point. Armed with the surveyor's official report, I drafted a formal notice. I looked up the legal language online and put together what's called a notice to cease and desist trespass. The letter was very specific about what Gary had done wrong and gave him exactly 72 hours to remove all fencing materials and restore my property to its original condition. I sent the letter via certified mail, which meant Gary had to sign for it personally. I also hand-delivered a copy to make sure he couldn't claim he never received it. Gary's response came 2 days later in the form of a handwritten letter shoved into my mailbox. This letter, which I still have, was exactly the kind of evidence I needed to take the next step. In his rambling, barely legible handwriting, Gary admitted that he had installed the fence. He claimed it was his right to protect his newly reclaimed land and suggested I should be grateful he was keeping my garden safe from vandals. Gary wrote that if I didn't like his fence, I was welcome to sue him, but warned that legal battles take years and cost thousands of dollars. What Gary didn't realize was that his letter was a written confession. He'd just admitted in his own handwriting to intentional trespass and installation of a hazardous device on my property. In legal terms, he'd handed me a smoking gun. Instead of suing Gary like he expected, I decided to take a different approach. I called the city's code enforcement office and filed a complaint about an unpermitted electric fence installation. I also contacted the fire marshal's office because the fence created a serious electrical hazard near dry garden mulch and wooden plant stakes. Both agencies scheduled inspections for the following week. But I wasn't done yet. I'd given Gary 72 hours to remove the fence voluntarily, and that deadline was approaching fast. Gary had made it clear he had no intention of backing down, so I needed to force his hand. I hired a professional fence removal company and scheduled them to begin work the morning after Gary's deadline expired. Since Gary had admitted in writing that the fence belonged to him, I instructed the removal crew to carefully dismantle everything and stack it neatly on Gary's driveway. I also sent Gary one final notice delivered by hand informing him that if the fence wasn't removed by the deadline, I would have it removed at his expense. The notice included copies of the surveyor's report and Gary's own letter as evidence of his trespassing. Gary's response was predictable. He told me to go ahead and sue him, that he wasn't scared of my threats, and that I'd regret messing with him. The morning of the deadline, I was up early watching from my kitchen window. Gary was in his yard by 6 a.m., watering his lawn like nothing was happening. He kept glancing toward my house with this smug expression like he was waiting for me to come out and beg him to remove the fence. At 8 a.m. sharp, the fence removal truck pulled up to my house. I'd hired a company that specializes in agricultural fencing, the kind of people who know how to safely disconnect electric systems without getting hurt. The crew chief introduced himself and asked me to show him what needed to be removed. As we walked into the backyard, I could see Gary watching from his kitchen window. When he realized what was happening, he came charging outside. Gary started yelling about how this was theft and vandalism. He threatened to call the police and have everyone arrested. The crew chief calmly explained that they were removing fencing materials from private property with the owner's permission, and if Gary had any objections, he should contact his lawyer. For the next 3 hours, I watched as professional fence installers carefully dismantled Gary's electric barrier. They disconnected the electrical components first, then removed the wire and posts. Everything was loaded onto a truck and driven around to Gary's driveway, where it was unloaded and stacked in neat piles. Gary spent the entire morning ranting about lawsuits and property rights, but he didn't actually do anything to stop the removal. I think deep down he knew he was wrong, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. Just as the removal crew was finishing up, 2 city vehicles pulled up to the curb. Code enforcement and the fire marshal had arrived for their inspections. This is where Gary's day went from bad to worse. The code enforcement officer examined the pile of fencing materials in Gary's driveway and asked him about permits. Gary's explanation about reclaiming his property didn't impress the officer, especially when I provided copies of the surveyor's report showing the fence had been entirely on my land. The fire marshal was more concerned about the electrical hazard Gary had created. Installing an electric fence without proper permits or safety measures near residential property is taken very seriously. The fact that the fence was accessible from a public sidewalk where children and pets could have been hurt made the violation even more serious. Gary tried to argue with both officers, insisting he had every right to protect his property. His voice kept getting louder and more aggressive as he realized the officials weren't buying his story. When the code enforcement officer asked to see the permits for the electrical installation, Gary exploded. He started screaming about government overreach and property rights. Gary called the officers idiots and threatened to have their jobs. This outburst was probably the worst thing he could have done under the circumstances. Both officers remained professional, but I could see they weren't amused by Gary's hostility. The code enforcement officer wrote him a citation for unpermitted hazardous installation and another for public endangerment. The fire marshal added a violation for creating an electrical hazard in a residential zone. The total fines came to just over $2,000. But I still wasn't finished with Gary. Armed with the surveyor's report, Gary's written confession, and the official citations, I filed a claim in small claims court. I sued Gary for the cost of the surveyor, the fence removal, damage to my lawn and garden, and compensation for the time I'd spent dealing with his trespassing. The small claims hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Gary showed up to court without a lawyer, still convinced he could talk his way out of trouble. He brought a folder full of what he called evidence, including some hand-drawn maps and photos of my garden taken from his property. The judge listened patiently to Gary's explanation about property lines and squatters' rights. Gary insisted he'd been protecting the neighborhood from my overgrown garden and that installing the fence was actually a public service. When it was my turn to present my case, I laid out the facts methodically. I started with the surveyor's official report clearly showing the fence was on my property. Then I introduced Gary's handwritten letter admitting he'd installed the fence. Finally, I presented the city citations proving Gary had violated multiple safety codes. Gary tried to interrupt several times, but the judge told him to wait his turn. The judge's decision was swift and decisive. Gary was ordered to pay all my expenses, including the surveyor's fee, the fence removal costs, and additional damages for the harm to my garden. The total judgment was just over $4,000. Gary stomped out of the courtroom muttering about appeals and corruption, but he never followed through on his threats. 3 weeks later, I received a check in the mail for the full judgment amount. With the settlement money, I hired a landscape contractor to repair the damage Gary's fence had caused. We filled in the post holes, reseeded the damaged lawn areas, and replanted the sections of garden that had been disturbed. But the best part was what I did with the remaining money. I decided to install a permanent boundary marker along the exact property line established by the surveyor. Instead of a fence, I chose a beautiful stone wall. Nothing too high or imposing, just an elegant low wall with native plantings that clearly defined where my property ended and Gary's began. The stone wall took 2 weeks to complete. Every day during construction, I noticed Gary watching from his windows. He could see exactly where his property line was, and more importantly, he could see how far onto my land his electric fence had actually been. The wall serves multiple purposes. It prevents any future boundary disputes, adds value to my property, and creates a nice backdrop for my garden. But most satisfying of all, it's a permanent reminder to Gary of what happens when you mess with your neighbor's property. These days, when I'm working in my garden, I sometimes catch Gary staring out at his window at the stone wall he inadvertently paid for. His view of my prize-winning vegetables is now partially blocked by the very barrier that exists because of his own actions. My garden has recovered completely from the fence incident. The rose bush that was damaged during the original installation has grown back stronger than ever. The herb section that was divided by Gary's wire has been replanted and expanded. If anything, the forced renovation actually improved the overall layout. Gary and I don't speak anymore, which suits me fine. He's tried a few times to start conversations when we're both getting our mail, but I just nod politely and go about my business. I'm not interested in pretending we're friends after what he put me through. The funniest part is that Gary's original complaint about my garden blocking his view has essentially come true, just not in the way he expected. The stone wall and expanded plantings now provide much more privacy between our properties than the original garden layout ever did. I learned several important lessons from this experience. First, document everything when dealing with difficult neighbors. Photos, written communications, and official reports can make the difference between winning and losing if things escalate to legal action. Second, sometimes the best response to aggression isn't more aggression. Gary expected me to get angry and do something stupid. By staying calm and working within the system, I was able to turn his own actions against him. Third, bullies like Gary count on their targets being too intimidated or too broke to fight back properly. Gary thought I'd be scared off by the threat of expensive legal battles. He never imagined I'd be willing to spend money up front on surveys and professional services to prove my point. Most importantly, I learned that some fights are worth having. My garden isn't just a hobby, it's a connection to the people who lived in my house before me and a source of genuine pride and joy. Gary tried to take that away from me, and I couldn't let him succeed. The whole ordeal took about 2 months from start to finish. 2 months of stress, paperwork, and uncertainty. But in the end, justice prevailed. Gary learned that you can't just take what isn't yours, even if you think you're clever enough to get away with it. Now, when I'm watering my tomatoes or pruning my roses, I take a moment to admire that stone wall. It represents more than just a property boundary. It's proof that sometimes if you're patient and methodical and willing to stand up for yourself, the good guys really do win. And every time Gary looks out his window and sees that wall, he's reminded of the same lesson. The next one is a malicious compliance story. Back about 7 years ago, I was promoted to office manager of a small construction company. I inherited a very messy role. The previous office manager was disorganized and technologically disadvantaged. When I came into the role, I was brand new to the type of work, but I have always been very detail-oriented. I didn't understand the vendor or inventory process, so I immediately began to log everything I could so I would be able to make reports/understand it all. Fast forward about 2 months into the role, and the owner of the company informs me he only wants to sign checks 1 day a week. Essentially, we would inform our vendors that any invoices received Friday to Thursday at noon would have a check cut and signed on Friday. I am not sure if this is standard anywhere else, but judging by a few vendors' reactions, it wasn't in this industry. Understandable, we are talking about truck drivers who go and pick up a load of material, pay for it, then deliver it to the job or our yard. So if they do that Friday, turn in the invoice, they are out $500 to $1,000 until the next Friday. They were used to being paid within 1 to 2 days, and some of these guys live paycheck to paycheck. It wasn't ideal for them. I sent out an email to the vendors and explained the processes. While not all of them were happy, no one had too much of an issue with it. I gave them, I think, like 2 weeks of notice before the policy would begin. Plus, we had worked with all of them for years. They knew we were good for the money. Then there was this one vendor. He stated it was going to be a headache. I apologized, explained this was the new policy and we couldn't adjust. He accepted it, I thought, and we moved on. 3 or 4 weeks later, he calls me in a hissy fit because he needs his check now. I apologized, explained to him that his check was going to be signed the next day. This was a Thursday, as per our policy, and told him my hands were tied. He hung up on me and called my coworker, project manager. He was screaming into the phone, which, since we were in the same tiny office, meant I heard every word. It ended with, "I won't work with that butch from here on out. I will only talk with you." Oh, really? That is how it is? Well, here's the thing. Like I said, I am pretty detail-oriented. The product he delivered to our yard was consistently off. My system would say we have 100 yards of it, but my super would be asking for 3 more loads, 45 yards each, because the back had roughly 10 yards left. I had brought up the issue with the owner in Super. We had established a new protocol that our personal crew truck drivers needed to fill out papers every day to show what they were taking to projects. I was keeping track of every yard, and sure, there should have been some loss, but 100 yards? I had always assumed it was a shortage on our end, that we were overusing this material, or they weren't tracking their loads to jobs correctly, or we were measuring it incorrectly in the back. Probably a combination of the three. After being called a beach, though, I called one of my vendors who delivered a different material and asked him if he could deliver this material. I told him how much we got, 45 yards a truck, usually 3 truckloads every other week for blank cost, and he was bewildered. He goes, "How is that guy matching that cost? That is unbelievably low." Then he asked me who the vendor was. He tells me, "That guy's truck can't carry more than 20 yards. And when I was hesitant to believe this, he added, "Do you get weight receipts?" I had never heard of weight receipts. Again, I was an absolute baby in this industry. No one had trained me. However, I had noticed that every other vendor had a weight written on their invoices, something I had logged but never paid too close attention to because we measured in yardage, not tonnage. There were some items that I would convert to yards because they only gave me weight, but then most had yards and tonnage notated, while this guy always turned in a handwritten ticket that said 45 yards. This is how it had always been. The office manager before me would order 3 loads of 45 yards of material. It would be delivered in the back. I don't think she would tell the back how much should be there, and I certainly never did either, not until I started to notice the discrepancies, not until I started creating processes to fix the discrepancies. Favorite vendor goes on to say, "Hey, I know the yard he picks up from. I pick up different material there and am friendly with them. They should have copies of the receipts. I am going to try to get them for you." He asked what day our last delivery was. I give him the details. Despite liking this vendor, I was pretty skeptical. Surely he just wants my business and wants me to pay more. Still, I couldn't lie and say I wasn't curious if what he was saying was right. That day, he texted me some photos of the receipts. Sure enough, that vendor's name is on them. The date matches. The driver's name matches. I hadn't shared that. The timestamps even matched from how long the drive from this yard to our yard was / when he arrived according to my cameras. So, he was picking up only 20 yards of the material each time. He was overcharging us 75 yards each time we ordered / paid, which is how he was giving us such a deal. It turns out the owner had demanded previous office manager negotiate this deal. I dug up all our past dealings with him. Unfortunately, previous office manager had not kept receipts, so I only had past checks in our system to go off of. We had worked with this guy for years. Potentially it was tens of thousands of dollars in theft, but without receipts / weight receipts, there wasn't much we could do except not work with him anymore. I asked favorite vendor for his price. I checked around with other vendors, found it to be a decent price, started to order from him from there on out. So yeah, that guy never worked with that betch again. He got what he wanted. He reached out to coworker a few times when we stopped ordering. Coworker told him each time, "Talk to office manager." He called me once, but I didn't answer. He had said he never wanted to talk to me again either, so he got his wish. I am no longer the office manager, thank God. I hated that role and rejoiced the day I was able to hire someone else for it. The current office manager still cuts checks on Fridays only. I was able to sit her down and give her a lot more information / training than I received. We now work with far more established companies that have 30-day policies and credit. This is more due to development in our area making bigger companies available to us. Favorite vendor actually sold his company to one of those bigger companies, which is sad but business. The next one is an entitled people story. You reap what you sow. Unfortunately, what I reaped from my childhood were deep self-esteem issues. My parents separated and divorced early. I struggled badly in school, and I had major difficulties with interpersonal relationships. After completing my vocational training as a legal assistant, I did manage to develop many skills that still benefit me today, but my low self-worth never fully stopped being an obstacle. During my time at the firm where I trained, I was assigned to work with a colleague. Let's call her Sandy. She was about 20 years older than me, had never formally trained for the job, and was supposed to work under me 2 days a week. From the start, working with her was incredibly difficult. She had very strong opinions, defended them aggressively, and communicated in a completely tactless and confrontational way. Unsurprisingly, she wasn't particularly popular at the firm. After 8 years, I eventually left that firm. It had developed in a direction I no longer felt comfortable with. I then joined a large international law firm originally from the US. From day one, performance expectations were brutal. After just 1 week, I was told that if my performance didn't improve, I wouldn't last long. 4 weeks later, I was fired. This was my first termination ever, and it completely shook me. I started doubting my abilities and myself. By then, Sandy had found a new job. About a year earlier, she had already tried to convince me to join her. I had declined back then because I felt loyal to my supervisor, and honestly, because I didn't want to work alone with Sandy. Now I was unemployed and terrified of starting something new. So I briefly returned to my old training firm. Nothing had changed there, but I regained some confidence. When Sandy contacted me again with a contract offer, I accepted. The offer sounded good: fewer working hours, more pay, and a fixed home office day. The downside was Sandy, but I accepted that. The first months working alone with her were hell. Furious phone calls over minor mistakes, constant accusations that I was destroying her firm and only producing bullcrap. Sure, I wasn't perfect, but Sandy had built a completely nonsensical system. Deadlines were recorded in 3 or 4 different places, all in different colors. Files were spread across countless folders, all of which had to be named exactly the way she wanted. Individuality was not tolerated. Even changing a comma or a dot in a document was seen as a personal attack on her authority as office manager. She also never hesitated to tell me she was better than me, and therefore deserved to earn more. About 6 months in, it became clear that Sandy had already built quite a reputation. Even our bosses struggled with her, and communication between legal assistants and lawyers was often non-existent. Then a new colleague joined. Let's call her Nadia. She had many years of experience and naturally became the office mom. Because of her competence and willingness, she was officially appointed office manager, handling court communications and internal matters Sandy wasn't interested in. At first, Sandy and Nadia got along. That changed when Sandy started micromanaging Nadia, dictating how she should work, step by step. This is where things went downhill fast. One day, Sandy discovered that Nadia used an underscore, instead of a dash in file names. Sandy started screaming and crying uncontrollably, claiming no one respected her rules. A new case management software was introduced requiring 2 months of setup and workflow design. Sandy refused to participate and instead took almost a month of vacation. Before that, she had fiercely resisted every idea. In one meeting about future procedures, Sandy pulled out printed invoices and loudly listed every single place where Nadia had supposedly ducked up. The meeting escalated, ending with Sandy saying it would be better if none of us were there at all. Another day, Sandy exploded because I formatted a signature as, let's say, Phoenix Wright Attorney at Law instead of Attorney at Law. Phoenix Wright, I explained that this was how I'd learned it in vocational school and that it's standard practice. She completely lost it, accused me of playing the victim, and claimed she never made things personal. I reminded her that she had repeatedly told me I was destroying the firm and only producing crap. She then said she regretted ever hiring me, that everyone had warned her about me, that nobody wanted me except her, and that I should be grateful. I stayed calm. A few hours later, she came to me crying, saying she didn't mean it and only said it to hurt me. The real problem, she said, was Nadia, who was evil and someone I should watch out for. Nadia was anything but evil. But this pattern was familiar. Sandy had changed jobs repeatedly, always believing someone else was being favored over her. This time was no different. The atmosphere worsened daily. There was hardly a meeting without insults. Even when I wasn't directly involved, it took a serious toll on me. While Sandy was on vacation, my boss informed me that the decision had been made to let her go. She refused to be a team player and wouldn't acknowledge that she was the problem. Sandy is gone now. And honestly, I expect the same story will repeat itself at her next job. As for me, this experience showed me that this profession is no longer for me. Last week, I started working in IT support, and I genuinely enjoy it. My self-image still isn't perfect, but I know I can reach my goals. I survived this person. I'll survive anything. Update. Hi everyone. First off, thank you so much for all the comments. I was honestly blown away. I went to sleep, and by the next morning, there were already several replies. I've never really posted on Reddit before, just a few gaming-related comments, so this was a really pleasant surprise. I wanted to go into a bit more detail and give an update on how I'm doing now. Sandy did have some good sides, and sometimes you could have normal conversations with her, but only when she was in the mood and her relationship was stable. During our time alone in the office, she went through 2 breakups, which made her mood extremely unpredictable. Some days she'd get furious, claiming my predecessor had done better work. Other times, she'd cry and act like she needed comfort. Everything always revolved around her. Even during breaks, the conversation was about what she did with her boyfriend or what she wanted to do to him out of revenge. I was so traumatized by her manipulation that I followed her blindly. If she criticized my competence, I agreed out of fear. On my days off, if I received her angry messages listing mistake after mistake, I couldn't be productive. I remember one day the train didn't run, so I asked my boss to take an unplanned work-from-home day. He approved immediately. A few hours later, Sandy sent a voice message saying I was taking too many liberties and couldn't make decisions without checking with her. My sister was visiting that day because she needed a home office setup. She was shocked at Sandy's tone and asked, "Can you really let her treat you like this?" I told her it was fine. This was just how Sandy communicated, brainwashing at its best. The funny thing is, though, when Sandy had emotional outbursts, it was suddenly okay for her to work from home because I can't take it here anymore. If you ever meet someone like this at work, don't believe a word they say. No one should have that much control over your life. With Nadia, it was a completely different experience. She immediately recognized that I'd been treated unfairly and reassured me that it's okay to make mistakes, even after years in the job. No one should be treated in a way that's traumatizing. I had a great working relationship with Nadia, and we got along really well. Even though we weren't best friends outside of work, we gave Sandy plenty of chances to contribute ideas to the new office structure. However, her suggestions were mostly about sticking to how things had always been done, rather than improving anything or creating solutions that actually benefited everyone. I remember a meeting where we reviewed file names to avoid conflicts. It was supposed to take 15 minutes, but lasted over an hour because she ranted about every single file, even small letter differences like LC to LA. Her complaints were always along the lines of, "I've had enough, I don't care about anything, you're deciding over me," etc. When she resigned, she still had to stay a few more weeks due to her notice period. She insisted on coming into the office even though she could have worked from home. Weeks later, she called in sick, and that was the end. As for me, I'm now working in IT support, and I'm loving it. It's completely new, and the fear I carried from the past hasn't come true. I still have a great relationship with everyone in my old office and left a really good impression on each of them. Thanks again, everyone. I wish you all the best. Take care of yourselves. Anyway, thank you for watching.